Go ahead and get started in a couple of moments, but if you are just now joining us, would love to just get to know who's in the space today. Feel free to share your name, maybe the organization that you're with, your pronouns, and maybe where you're calling in from. My name is Nick G. I am on our advocacy team with Chinese for Affirmative Action, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's book talk with Bianca Mabute-Louie. And today's event is hosted by the Chinese Historical Society of America and Chinese for Affirmative Action. Today's event is actually part of a week-long series titled Born in the USA, Wong Kim Ark and the Fight for Citizenship. And there will be events starting today through this Friday, March 28th, which actually marks the 127th anniversary of the landmark Supreme Court case, United States versus Wong Kim Ark. And as a collective, we chose the title Born in the USA because birthright citizenship means that all children born here, regardless of their color, creed, or class, are US citizens. And this is a simple yet powerful constitutional right, which Black Americans fought for, a Chinese American affirmed, and that we all benefit from. And now this fundamental right is being under attack. And so we want to start off our programming this week by kind of talking a little bit more about what does it mean to belong and to unassimilate from this culture and to really try to ask this question, what does it mean to belong here? And so we're grateful for you to be taking the time to be with us here today, whether you're on your lunch break or you're joining us on one of your breaks throughout the day. We're just really grateful. But before we jump into today's incredible dialogue, if you haven't had a chance just to share where you're calling in from, would love to just get a sense of who you are, who's in the room with us. And I'm kind of already seeing some folks in here that it looks like we have some folks from calling in from California, from Canada, and some other folks joining us. So just share some love in the chat for wherever you're calling in from. But it's great that you are here. As I mentioned before, my name is Nick G. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm part of the advocacy team with Chinese for Affirmative Action. We are a 57-year-old civil rights-based organization in San Francisco's Chinatown and a founding partner of the Stop API Hate Coalition. Before we get started today, just want to set a few ground rules. One, we really encourage folks to use the chat to share what you're thinking and feeling. Two, we ask folks to please be respectful. We will not tolerate racism, xenophobia, sexism, or harmful and derogatory comments in the chat. And lastly, if you could please use the Q&A function to add your questions that may arise during the conversation, and we'll do our best to address them later on in the program. We are joined by two very amazing panelists today. One is Bianca Mabute-Louie, who's the author of Unassimilable, and Janice Petty, the interim director of the Chinese Historical Society of America. We'll be having a robust conversation between both Bianca and Janice, and I'm really excited that all of you are here. And if you haven't had a chance yet to read Unassimilable, I would really encourage you to get your hands on this very, very soon. Because as I was thinking about Wong Kim Ark Week, as I have been thinking about this question of what does it mean to be American in a moment in time when Chinese immigrants and people who look like me are being under attack, I think this book starts to unpack some of the things that I'm holding on to. And so with that, today we'll actually be having about a 45-minute discussion. We'll do our best to have some questions from the audience, but thank you in advance for submitting your questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce Janice Petty to open us up for today's book discussion. Janice, I'll let you take it away from here.
Thank you, Nick, and welcome to this exciting book talk with Bianca Mabute-Louie. I'm really looking forward to this. The Chinese Historical Society of America is an organization that's been around for 63 years. We're located in Chinatown in San Francisco, and we're delighted to be a co-presenter of this book talk today, along with CAA, because the story of Wong Kim Ark, as Nick just said, is an important one. It's important in terms of the history that it affords to all of us who are interested and concerned with birthright citizenship, with the history of Chinese Americans. And it's also a part of where we are in 2025. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation with Bianca about how the past and the present are intersecting through, in part, Bianca's very interesting and amazing book that she's written. A little bit about CHSA. What we do is we are a leading organization in the community that preserves and presents the history of Chinese Americans. We're the oldest Chinese American historical society in the United States. We are housed in an historic building in Chinatown in San Francisco. So we are very much present in the community, where in some ways it may have all begun back in the 1800s and where we continue to center our efforts today. Why are we presenting this program? Um, Bianca's book is about race, belonging, and solidarity in America, and it resonates with our mission, CHA's mission, of serving as a center for research, scholarship, and learning to inspire a greater appreciation for and to acknowledge the collective Chinese American experience to inform audience. Another point of why we are doing this is that Bianca's book shapes a unique perspective on the Chinese American identity and immigration stories. And identity and immigration stories are a central part of Bianca's book. And I look forward to, like I said earlier, engaging with you, Bianca, in some conversation around that. So, what I'm going to do now is stop talking and welcome Bianca to this book talk.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here, all of the labor and coordination that went behind hosting this book talk. Um, in many ways, this is very exciting because even though this is online, it feels a little bit like a homecoming. I spent a lot of time in the Bay Area and I taught Asian American Studies at the Chinatown campus of CCSF for a little bit, where I would bring my students to CHSA. I also, have just respected and been a benefactor of the work of CAA for a long time as well. It was the Acre Network that was one of the first, I think, really safe and empowering spaces that I came across once I left the church, which I talk about in the book if you've read it. So anyways, that's just a little bit of intro about me. Again, I'm grateful to be here and for the labor to put on this extremely important and timely week of programming and to be part of this historic week of programming. So how it's going to go, as others have said, we'll have conversation, me and Janice. But before that, I'm going to do a quick reading from the book. And then Janice and I will talk, and then we'll open it up for questions. This is from the introduction chapter of the book, Unassimilable. And I'm starting on page 2 in case you have the book and wanted to follow along. My popo relocated from Hong Kong to join us in San Gabriel Valley when she was in her 70s. When she and her husband prepared to retire and settle down in Hong Kong, he instead decided to start a new family with a woman decades younger whom he'd had a secret affair with for almost 10 years. Without any options and overwhelmed by shame, my popo left her home, her apartment where she raised 3 children with her ex-husband and her mahjong group in Hong Kong to live with us in San Gabriel. She started over at 70 in a foreign place where she couldn't speak the language, didn't have any peers, and couldn't get around. She was isolated and heartbroken. With barely a kindergarten education, her life ambition was to become a wife and a mother. She loved flaunting how good she was at both roles. In true Cantonese matriarch fashion, she bragged incessantly to her social circles about her husband's and children's accomplishments. Now, with 3 adult children with families of their own, she was not needed as a mother and no longer a wife. She felt she had no purpose. Her ex-husband's affair decimated all status and belonging she held in their community. When I was a child, she would insist, "Your popo has become a useless nothing." It perplexed me because I never saw her that way. But getting left by her husband wasn't her entire story. With the safety net of the ethnoburb, she rebuilt. After living with us for a few years, she moved into her own 1-bedroom apartment on Main Street in Alhambra, a city that neighbored San Gabriel at the heart of the ethnoburb. She walked to 85 degrees every day, where they rang a cowbell whenever fresh baos came out of the oven. She made friends with Cantonese neighbors in her building, and they started their own mahjong group where they would debrief the latest episode of whichever Cantonese drama that aired on TVB the previous night. She found a Cantonese church and got baptized. She never learned English, drove recklessly in the 99 Ranch parking lot, and didn't give a fuck. She may have confirmed a few stereotypes, but the ethnoburb saved her. She stayed unapologetically herself through the upheavals of divorce and displacement. In the safety net of SGV, she got her groove back. Sometimes my mom would take my popo and out of SGV to go window shopping in Beverly Hills, and they would drag me along. As a child, popo outside of the ethnoburb was a frightening, multisensory experience. She always brought her full self. She was large and in charge. She tried to bargain and make deals in Cantonese at Saks. They do not speak Cantonese there. They also do not tolerate haggling there. Her voice and presence were always loud, even and especially when we were the only Asians around. You don't speak Cantonese? Too bad, and sit tight, because Popo is about to start her diatribe about her cheating ex-husband, who you've never met before, in a language you don't understand. 626 or 90210, my Popo did not code switch. I, on the other hand, started my PhD in code switching when I was 9 after transferring to an uppity predominantly white private school. Popo outside of the ethnoburb was an unassimilable tornado that left me in the dust, embarrassed and flustered. Whiteness taught me to be ashamed of her behavior because whiteness is actually terrified of people like my Popo coming out of the ethnic enclave and daring to assert herself into white spaces. When immigrants like my Popo settle in a place like SGV en masse, white people are so afraid that they need to relocate. It's called white flight. It scares them when we collectively create our own belonging without participating in the traditional time-honored process of assimilation. In ethnoburbs like SGV, white flight occurred because, quote, too many Asians like my Popo arrived, bought up property, refused to acculturate, and made it our own. We disturb whiteness and destabilize American respectability politics when we create and thrive in our own systems without them. The ethnoburb flourishes despite not assimilating. In fact, it flourishes because it doesn't assimilate. My Popo and the ethnoburb demonstrate that we can create our own power and belonging without learning English, participating in white institutions, and Americanizing. But it is a communal endeavor, one that requires everybody's imagination and care. Unassimilability is not an act of individualism. It is an interdependent community of Popos finding each other, helping each other refill their prescriptions, and setting weekly dim sum dates so nobody gets too isolated. I question if my Popo could have had her comeback tour if not for the Asian immigrants who came before and with her, collectively creating their own sense of home in the diaspora through the ethnoburb. As many early Asian immigrants to this country were barred from accessing white institutions, working together to build and protect the ethnic ecosystem was a matter of survival and necessity. Over a century later, unassimilability is the vision I witnessed among my Popo and her friends in the ethnoburb, relying on each other in their collective insistence to thrive in their latter years, away from their homelands. Unassimilability is about cultivating our own social networks and daring to prosper in America without whiteness. It is our ancestors and the elders creating home. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. I've read the book, and I imagine many of you have, and you may have questions. And what we'd like to invite you to do is post your questions using the Q&A function to submit them, and we will then address them with Bianca as the talk proceeds. But to get us started, Bianca, I have a question about the use of your book. The title of the book suggests a deep exploration of identity. How do you see the concept of assimilation affecting the experience of marginalized communities, particularly in context of this week, Wong Kim Ark Week, and the life of Wong Kim Ark?
Yeah. So the whole, I mean, if you can glean from the short excerpt I read, the whole book is an argument against assimilation. And I use my Popo and the ethnoburb where I grew up, San Gabriel Valley. So I forgot to mention that in the beginning, but before the Bay Area, I lived for 18 years there. My parents are still there. My cousins and aunties and uncles are still there. as this argument of anti-assimilation, right? That we actually thrive by creating our own ecosystems, and this politic of refusal and this unapologetic care for our immigrant communities. And that is what helps us thrive as Asian diasporic communities. And actually, I was having some technical difficulties. I was hoping to show the visuals of this, but at the end of that chapter, the introduction chapter, I have these political comics, these political cartoons. Um, and the first one is about Wong Kim Ark. And so hopefully this is incentive to get the book so you can see the graphics. I'm sorry I wasn't able to pull it up today. But I tell the story, right, of Wong Kim Ark, who was born in the US, and he goes home, which is a very difficult thing to do at that time, right? To be able to afford and make the trip back to his homeland. And then on his way back, he gets detained. He's denied entry and he's detained for 5 months, unable to return to his home in San Francisco. And so in this zine and throughout the book, I question then, like, what is belonging and what is citizenship in this country, right? Assimilation is not just necessarily about integrating into the host country and the host society and the type of cutting off from your own culture and your own ties that comes with assimilation. But if you look closely at the particularities of the Wong Kim Ark case, it's actually very revealing, right? That he was detained when he was trying to come back to America after his trip home. He wasn't detained when he was working or living in the US. He wasn't detained when he was going grocery shopping in San Francisco, Chinatown, although, of course, Chinese immigrants and their descendants were harassed and policed doing everyday things. He was specifically detained after an effort to go home and to cultivate his ties with his family and his homeland and to come back. That was the kind of site, that particular site of return was where the detention happened. And so then when we step back again and look at Wong Kim Ark, the Supreme Court case, of course, is about the contestation of who is a citizen. But the actual events of the incident, I think, is, again, really revealing. It's about whether someone who was born in America, living as an American, is allowed to go home and have roots outside of America, right? And so those are kind of the interrogations of citizenship and home and belonging I'm doing in the book. And the reality is that unless we are indigenous to this land, we all have roots and we all have ties elsewhere. And so again, going back to the question of assimilation and Wong Kim Ark Week, right? This cutting off that is this question of, like, are you allowed to be American if you haven't cut off all your ties, if you're still trying to cultivate these ties to your home culture in your indigenous lands, right? It points to the violence of the American racial project and of the project of American citizenship, that to be American implies that there is this cutting off of what is yours. And we see that with other marginalized groups too, right? Whether it's the theft of people from their homelands, which was done to enslaved Africans, or whether it's assimilation that is legislated, as was done to indigenous peoples via assimilationist boarding schools, or the criminalizing of immigrants to be able to speak their own language, or even just the cultural compulsory assimilation the idea and the myth that you have to become as close to white as possible to survive here, right? So many marginalized people's experiences in this country in regards to race points back to the separation and the violence of the US racial project. And so again, that's the context. And that's why I think this particular week really matters, not just, again, yes, because of birthright citizenship, but really the contradictions of birthright citizenship that lead me to this politic of refusal that I write about, that I don't, want to, I really question what belonging and citizenship means here, when, as we see in this historical case until today, citizenship is precarious and conditional and contradictory.
Thank you, Bianca. Part of your book, you talk about the role of the church in a major part of your growing up in San Gabriel Valley. And I actually have a quote from something that you wrote on sentence on page 91, where you said, I was attracted to the conviction and community that evangelism or evangelicalism provided. And then we have a question that I'm going to read to you. And ask you to elaborate on this. Question is, I'm wondering if you have any conversations about the book with any Chinese American evangelical churches that may be open to your concerns. I'm speaking as the granddaughter of a paper son and grass widow. I'm a poet and writer. I'm also an evangelical, though I have trouble with that label now, who grew up in the Chinese American church in New York City and New Jersey, though that may not share all of that with your concerns. I can relate to some extent.
Yeah. I explore the ethnoburb. I explore education, in particular, predominantly white institutions with a lot of Asians. That's what I coined them in the book, as well as lastly, the ethnic church as three kind of central sites where I explore assimilation and the refusal to assimilate. And I share about how I went to a PWI, predominantly white institution, where I felt very kind of like there were other Asians around me, but I felt like I had my own particular experience and estrangement and loneliness because of my class and socioeconomic experience. But then I went to the Chinese church and I went to youth group at the Chinese church when I was a high schooler, and it was like, oh my gosh, this whole world opened up to me. I felt like centered as a youth for the first time. There were youth from my neighborhood who went to that church, and I felt this radical sense of belonging as a young person going to youth group. And I trace the ethnic church and the ethnic evangelical immigrant church in particular, right, as this safe place that immigrants built and Asian immigrants in particular built because they experienced exclusion from a predominantly white speaking society. A lot of times, the only place, even to today, that you'll see people in your ethnic group in a role of leadership is in the church. Um, and yet, my experience in the church was very contradictory and very hard because when I came out as queer and when they decided, I was part of the ethnic evangelical church, and then I joined a very evangelical campus ministry that I was part of for like 8 years. So this was my whole ecosystem, my whole worldview. And so when I came out, and it coincided with that organization drawing a line in the sand, basically saying everyone who works here has to abide by a very traditional heterosexist definition of male and female gender norms and heterosexual marriage. And that's in many ways I had always kind of seen the contradictions of these teachings. But it was really then when I began to interrogate the ethnic church, not just as a safe haven, but actually as a site to perpetuate mainstream norms around gender and sexuality. And from there, also actually a site that is an extension of colonialism in many ways. I remember in high school we had like missions trips to indigenous lands in Arizona, right? Like I don't write super in depth about that in the book, but I really interrogate like how contradictory this site is and how painful this site is. I was essentially pushed out and what felt like an excommunication. I lost the majority of my community. And again, it wasn't just like people I worked with and saw on Sundays. It was people I also lived with and roomed with. It was just, I was so immersed and then suddenly felt so cut off. And so I need to go back to the question because I'm going off the rails here. But I think for me right now, I'm a scholar and in many ways of religion in the role of race making and politics. And I continue to see the evangelical immigrant church as a very complicated, contradictory site that, again, serves very urgent needs of immigrant communities, and at the same time, in many ways, have reified the norms and politics and ideologies at times of white Christian nationalism.
Great, thank you. So, what were some of the challenges that you faced while you were writing Unassimilable? I mean, how did you overcome them?
Some of the challenges, well, there's very practical challenges of I had a baby in the middle of writing a book, so that makes it a little challenging. I so I pushed extensions. I had to really rely on my biological extended family and chosen family, and I faced a lot of, I think, personal like not to glamorize grind culture, but the last month before my deadline nearly destroyed me. I feel like, right? I'm like, I have an infant. I'm trying to get to this deadline. It is like writing a book is like birthing another baby, and I had these two babies that I was taking care of. Um, but a big part of the book is about community and collective care. And I write about this in the acknowledgments, but I had such a wide range of support. And I really thank the childcare workers, my mother-in-law, the titas in my partner's community who were able to do the very undervalued labor of child caretaking so that I could sit at my computer and finish my book. And then there was also the challenge of, so I also didn't share this in my introduction, but I'm also a PhD candidate. I'm finishing my doctorate in sociology. And this book is it's written for the public. There's cartoons in it, and it kind of defies the typical norms of academic writing. And so I struggled a lot, especially the first few years writing the book. I began it in 2021, and I started my PhD program in 2020. But I hid the book from my entire academic community, my advisor, my peers, because there is this sense that it wasn't the type of writing that is valued in the academy. They value peer-reviewed journal articles and books with academic presses that write in a certain way, that write to the canon of my field, that use a lot of jargon. And so I really had to personally believe in the project and believe that the way that and the voice that I'm choosing to write with is worth the labor and the time. And to just trust that once it comes out, people can think what they think, but I had to trust that I believed in the worth of the project and the book. Mhm.
Thank you. Yep. In what ways do you think community, I mean, you write about community, and so what ways, a lot, does community play in shaping identity? Big question.
Yeah, I mean, there's no there's no identity to me without community, right? Even as a sociologist, it's like everything is socially constructed, whether by the state or by our own sense of community and meaning making, right? Like there's no sense that like this individualistic sense that like this is who I am and I will self-actualize because I have this thought in my brain of who I want to be. Even that is very much constructed by your social conditions and the people you're around. I'm trying to think about how to answer this question because there are so many ways I do go into this, right? I talk about some of the so I talk about the church community, the contradictions there, but I also talk about this concept of disposability politics that happens in community organizing communities, that sometimes the tough negotiation of um, how do we not, when there is harm done, how do we hold people accountable but not throw people away? How do we stay in movements and really be constantly providing on-ramps for more people to be joining our movements, and yet also erect boundaries when we need boundaries to keep our community safe, right? I really like, that's a particular tension in the book that I really explore. And then I really interrogate the Asian American community. And when I say interrogate, I mean, I interrogate the term Asian American. And so in the last chapter, and also in the first chapter, a big motivation of writing the book was how the tensions I felt about the term Asian American and how I often felt like, we know, I think a lot of folks in this room know that the origins of the term Asian American were super anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist, radical to begin with from the 1960s anti-war and Asian American movement. It was inspired by the Black Power movement in many ways. When I started the book, I was feeling very ambivalent about the utility of the Asian American political identity, and felt that in many ways it had become watered down to identity, to representation and inclusion politics. And I'm going to come back to the question, Janice, but when I started the book, it was on the heels of the Atlanta spa shooting in 2021, and also on the heels of my grandmother passing away. And so I was reckoning with, this escalation of violence, interpersonal and state violence against our communities. And I was just paying attention to the discourse coming from our community. And I was noticing that there were certain factions of the Asian American community that were putting forward and organizing around this discourse of we don't deserve to be hate crimes because we belong here, because we're good citizens, we're American, we pay taxes, we labor to build this country, and all of those things were true. But I was just feeling like, what if I don't want to belong here, right? What does community and Asian diasporic political identity mean if I, again, think that this is a moment not to prove our belonging, but actually to this country, but actually to indict this country, right? Do I really want to belong? This is 2021. We just had a racial reckoning. Do I really want to belong to this super anti-Black genocidal country? And now that question continues to persist. What does it mean to be American? I get to pay taxes to fund multiple genocides, you know? And so I question like the term, and I invite us in the book at the end to consider this term Asian diaspora, which is less about inclusion and belonging into this capital S state that, again, funnels our tax dollars instead of into education, into bombs, right? And I invite us to use the term diaspora because it asks us, why are we in diaspora in the first place? It interrogates the idea that the Asian American or Asian diasporic story starts when we arrive here. No, it doesn't. Asian American history starts before Angel Island, before Gold Mountain, right? It interrogates the ongoing dynamics of coloniality and racial capitalism and Western interference in our home countries that lead to diaspora. And it invites us and beckons this anti-imperialist solidarity and collective identity with all diasporic peoples and oppressed peoples who have been similarly impacted by US empire and coloniality and racial capitalism. So again, it is an orienting to question, why are we here in a diaspora, and to, again, be in solidarity with all oppressed peoples who have also been similarly impacted by US empire, as opposed to this politic of wanting to be included. And if we only get enough seats in this system, again, I'm not saying like that doesn't have its place, but I'm again questioning inclusion as the appropriate use of our energy toward liberation.
Thank you. Bianca, we have a question from Paige. Paige asks, I'm really interested in intergenerational aspects of our lives and experiences. What do you think unassimilability looks like across generations, from our own lineage or more broadly?
Yeah, that is such a great question. It's interesting, I think, even like talking to my parents about, well, I didn't really talk to my parents about the book, but they did come to one of my events when I was in LA. And to be honest, I haven't debriefed that much with them. We're going on a trip actually tonight together, and I'm going to ask them more what they thought. But it's interesting, right? Because for them, I think, and for a lot of my family and for myself, I wrote about this in the book, but the aspirational way I shared about my popo, I didn't think of her as aspirational when she was alive. You know, the ways that she refused to belong here, I think for our family, when she was alive it often felt very difficult for us. And she was, you know, like when you read about it, I think, again, I write about her and I memorialize her in a certain way. But when she was alive, she was what we would call a, quote, difficult woman. And so this idea of refusing to assimilate, my parents, even though they raised us in the ethnoburb and it's where they call home, in many ways, they and I were really embarrassed of my popo doing the most at Saks, right? And so it's been interesting talking to older people in my community about it. And I think just presenting an alternative way to look at moments like that. And alternative meanings that we can draw from those moments that, again, at the time felt very maybe kind of cringy and difficult to accept and difficult to navigate. And honestly, in the moment I wrote, I think I read this part that I was like, I don't know her, like, don't associate us together. And so, yeah. And at the same time, like, I think when I think of older generations, I don't think they really found much relevance to the term Asian American anyway. right? They felt relevance to maybe their ethnic community and their ethnic identity. And I'm talking about mostly first generation Asian immigrants, maybe. Um, and so this term Asian diaspora, I don't think it's that radical of a shift if they, again, never felt connected to the particular nostalgia of the Asian American identity, but it is really just an invitation to consider the broader consequences of the American government and violence, not just domestically, but all over the world, and to consider what community might look like, not just with people who look like you, but more so with people who are impacted by these structures in distinct yet connected ways.
You ever think about what your grandmother might say if she were able to read your book?
I do wonder. I mean, I think I want to say she would be proud, hopefully, that hopefully she feels well represented and celebrated. Um,
And the fact that her story is being told.
yeah.
Yeah, well, which is important. Thank you. I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, please put them on Q&A and we will put them on the screen so that I can post them to Bianca. I want to get back to historical context and Wong Kim Ark. So can we talk a little bit, or can you talk about how Wong Kim Ark and his experiences influenced your writing? Was there, you have that 8-page, 6-page zine on Wong Kim Ark, and I saw that and I thought, oh, this is interesting. I wonder what caused Bianca to add that.
Yeah. So I added it at the end, actually. So I started writing the book in 2021, and Wong Kim Ark is something. The Supreme Court case was something that I always taught when I was teaching Asian American studies. It's like a staple of the curriculum, right? But I went back to it because I think I was making edits when during, I think maybe Trump's early campaigning for his second term, he was threatening to take away birthright citizenship. And so it made me think about and at that time, I didn't really hear a lot of discussion about Wong Kim Ark, except because he was, I mean, he talks a lot, and you never, there's just so much to respond to. But I remember thinking about the case and wanting to go back to the case, and then as I was making edits, wanting to actually interrogate more of why birthright citizenship was being brought up and the possible direction that our country was headed. I didn't know that it would, I didn't know who would get elected. I didn't know what was going to happen, right? But as I thought about it more, right, it was really relevant to a lot of stuff that was happening in the news cycle, but has always happened because of America. And that is family separation, um, trying to use the power of the courts to define the boundaries of belonging, the boundaries of who is American and who is not. Um, it talks about, the experience of Wong Kim Ark is really one about transnationalism, right? The extent that we are able to, or even allowed to, maintain ties to our home countries and our home communities while we are in the diaspora. And again, I think it was such a clear example of how even when something is written into law, exclusion and discrimination still persist, because in the case, ultimately, even with birthright citizenship, Chinese immigrants were required to carry documentation around with them, and they were stopped and again policed and harassed. And we see this with like everybody in this country, where even more recently, European green card holders are being detained. And that was something I did not anticipate. That was, I mean, we know what this country has done and threatens to do to racialized peoples, but I mean, this administration is really, again, pushing the boundaries of what they can get away with. And so, yeah, I put this, I decided to explore the case and put this story through the zine at the end of this chapter, because again, I thought it was such a clear way to demonstrate the contradictions of citizenship. And in the last slide of that zine, I question, what does citizenship even mean, right? Again, I mentioned this earlier that I get to belong to a country that sends bombs to maim little children and wipe out family lines in Palestine, and has actually done that since the beginning of this. Like, what are we trying to belong to? And when we interrogate the contradictions of birthright citizenship and how ultimately, even if you have citizenship, of course, it is an incredibly important protection. And I'm not saying that there's an obvious safety that comes with citizenship. And we know that when we look at the precarity and vulnerability of undocumented folks. And at the same time, we know, most recently through Stop Asian Hate, for example, how citizenship and belonging are conditional and precarious. And so again, the hope is that through this interrogation of citizenship and assimilation, it postures us into a politic of refusal, and through really, collectively actually indicting the contradictions of this country rather than, again, laboring to prove ourselves as worthy of citizenship.
We have a question from Grace, who is asking you if you've done any research on urban Chinese churches and any differences that you may have seen. She writes that I've had a huge culture clash growing up in a much more moderate and open church in Brooklyn than moving to a mostly white New Jersey suburbs and attending a much more quote unquote assimilated Chinese church.
Um, my research on religion and Chinese churches right now is mostly in the South, actually, which is a very particular part of the country, but informative to the rest of the country, I think. I'm looking, I mean, yeah, I think, to be honest, my experience was in an urban Chinese church in Los Angeles, and I think assimilation, I'm trying to understand the question, I think. Oh, okay, there's a second part. For example,
Yeah.
okay.
So our Brooklyn church in the
Oh,
70s
okay, okay.
facilitated the bringing over and settling
Hmm.
of Southeast Asian refugees during the
Got
Vietnam.
it. So it sounds like, from what I'm gleaning from the question, Grace, that it sounds like the church you grew up in maybe was more open and progressive than the assimilated, you said, Chinese churches and white, in mostly white New Jersey suburbs that you are now part of. Yeah, I mean, I think proximity, and the more progressive, hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, but the more progressive churches that, for example, facilitate the bringing over and resettling of Southeast Asian refugees. I mean, I think when you're in an urban area, maybe there's more proximity to other racial groups, and so you're kind of forced in some ways to confront like a multiracial society and what that means. But at the same time, I mean, I actually have done some research on churches in urban areas like Los Angeles and Chicago, where there's a lot of diversity and you see a lot of actually anti-Blackness. And so I don't really have an answer for you, except that from what I have found from my personal experience and research, it just feels like these sites are full of contradictions and perpetuate, I think, a lot of white racial logics. And maybe that wasn't your experience in your Brooklyn church, but perpetuate a lot of racial logics that we learn from whiteness. So that anti-Blackness and xenophobia, a lot of those things are actually very prominent in Chinese churches from what I have found.
So we have a question from Kana. I love the example of your popo. I want that for everyone. And what might acting unassimilable look
Mm.
like? People where assimilation happened generations ago, who no longer have many connections to a source culture or country. How might we rethink belonging and identity so that it can emphasize connection and solidarity rather than reinforce cultural gatekeeping?
I love this question, Kana. Also, I can't see anyone in this like webinar mode, but just sending hearts to Kana. Um, I love this question because I also got this question at a lot of my book events, right? Like, what does unassimilable mean if I'm a fifth generation Japanese American, or if I'm an Asian adoptee and I was adopted by white parents and I ended up in Nebraska, right? And that question is so actually exciting to me because um, to me, unassimilable is not really about going back to something. It isn't about going back to recover something that was once lost. It's actually thinking ahead. And again, it isn't about this cultural gatekeeping that you're talking about, but it's thinking ahead into an expansive solidarity and an expansive political identity that folks who are fifth generation, for example, or folks who are adopted are actually central to the politic of being unassimilable, because there's so much to learn and excavate about what maybe compulsory or forced assimilation has looked like. I think in particular, I had a really like in-depth conversation about this in Portland, actually, where there are a lot of Asian adoptees in the audience. And to me, it was like, yeah, there's nothing, for a lot of them, they're saying like, there's nothing to go back to, right? There's so much loss and pain. And the context that something like being an Asian adoptee was actually part of the American imperialist project, right? That adoption, in particular, going back to evangelicals again, white evangelical adoption of Koreans, for example, that was part of the US imperialist project in Korea. And so then, right, the politic of unassimilable must center those stories, because it highlights, again, why are we in diaspora? We are in diaspora because of coloniality and the violence of US empire. And I think an example like Asian adoptees feeling like they're not able to trace something back, that is actually central to the experience, and why I think being unassimilable is important. It's not just about tracing back maybe language or cultural traditions you learn, but it's actually adopting this politic of refusal, right? It isn't just, I refuse to learn English or like assimilate with white people. It's actually about refusing to assimilate to American politics of imperialism and empire. So it's less of I would say, a cultural argument and more of a political posturing and political orientation that is for everyone, especially I think if you are Asian and you have felt gatekept from Asian spaces and Asian culture. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say about that.
We have a few more minutes, and we can, if you've got a question that, again, you'd like to ask Bianca, post on the Q&A. But I have a question, and it has to do with, what do you want your readers to feel or think, or what would you like for us to feel or think after reading the book? Are there specific conversations or reflections that you hope to inspire? Are there thoughts that you would like to share with, say, groups of people, other book talks, book clubs, groups of people who are talking about the concept of unassimilability? I can't even say that word, much less
It,
sometimes.
it's a mouthful, and I apologize for choosing a title that is such a mouthful for me as well. I think the call to act, by the time you get to the end, right, the call to action, and I feel even more certain about this in this particular moment in history, is to build and join political community. That the book really is, it's an exploration of assimilation and history and Asian diasporic experiences and identity, but ultimately everything really comes back to community, building community and strengthening community. I think in particular in this moment where we are seeing people denied their basic rights, where we are seeing green card holders who are PhD students who are being illegally abducted by ICE. We are seeing, I mean, whether you have a quote criminal record or you're being, kind of portrayed as this like high achieving, highly productive immigrant, regardless, like everyone, no matter what you have achieved or what titles you have, everyone deserves safety and to be safe with their families and to be able to move around freely and to be able to protest and express their political views. And I think the only way we can protect that value is actually to be very strategic about being in political community together and building coalitions together. I think my views on this and my theory of change on this have developed since the book has come out. But really that, I mean, for me, right, like going to a few protests here and there and trying to be involved. I do book clubs in my community. That's not doing it for me anymore. I'm like, we need political coalition and strategy. And so for myself, and this is again what I hope other readers will feel inspired to do also, is to really be integrated in political coalition and community that is actively, and I know so many folks in this Zoom are already initiating and creating those communities and have created on-ramps for people to join those communities, to really be intervening and becoming the antidote to the imminent, not even imminent, it's already here, the fascism and the violence that is at our doorsteps.
Andy wrote, and I think that you've answered it, but you might want to elaborate more. He says he's asking if you were to write an unassimilable manifesto for this moment in history, what would be its core principles?
Yeah, I did write an unassimilable manifesto, right? The subtitle is an Asian diasporic manifesto for the 21st century, and the core principles are to be in coalition together. And I think to define, unpack that term a little bit more, I think coalition is different from being um, just friends who like go to things together. I think being in coalition is being in conspiring with people, organized groups that are similar to you as well as different from you, but who have similar interests, not just maybe locally, but thinking transnationally, right? Like, I mean, I think about, in the 1960s and 70s, where there was this movement of revolutionary anti-colonial movements across the global South. That didn't just happen because people were, I mean, it happened because these movements motivated and inspired each other. There were conferences where African and Asian nations met together to strategically think through how to overthrow their colonial occupiers, right? And to take that then back to the local level, like I think for there to be radical change, things cannot continue going on as they are. Even from a climate change perspective, we as a species literally will not survive if we continue going down this path. We need radical change, which means we also need radical community with each other and coalition with each other. That is very, I think, strategic and decidedly political and defiant to the agenda that we're seeing now. And I think the second part of it, in addition to community, is really, again, being critical, and critical not in a way of like always critiquing the system. I mean, yes, that's very central to it, right? But that's my move towards diaspora, really being critical of why are we here and how can that inform our political action. And then I'm going to add one more, but really it is the revolutionary optimism and the revolutionary joy that must be also central to our movements and our organizing to keep us moving and going. And I think, again, more recently, this is all like revelations and insights I think that have happened after the book has come out. But in the past few months, I think trying to be a little bit more integrated in my local community and seeing, I have never seen so much violence, but I have also never felt so much, I think, revolutionary joy and hope. Like, I think for people who have been on the ground and doing this work, like we understand what the assignment is. And we understand that this violence and this eroding of institutions, all of these things falling apart, is what is necessary for there to be the radical change that we want to see happen. And in the process, we have to be defending and fighting for each other, but also imagining and creating new systems and new worlds and new ecosystems of care, because what is currently available here, and when I say what, I mean everything from the education system to the healthcare system. Hello, like nothing works here, okay? That's what it feels like sometimes. Then how do we reimagine taking care of each other outside of those systems? And I think about that a lot as an educator, thinking about learning and teaching outside of the academic system, because I mean, it's been very clear. It's been made very clear. These universities are war profiteering landlords that happen to do classes on the side, right? So then for me, who I feel called to the classroom, then how do I build the classroom as a liberatory site, not just within, but beyond these institutions?
Right. I'm going to read a post that came up a few minutes ago, and in probably will resonate with many of the people who are on this book talk with Bianca. Marion Kwan writes that I totally concur with Bianca's hope that we can assimilate into political groups. I'm an elder and was involved in the civil rights movement in 1965-66 and am active still with the Bay Area Civil Rights Movement. Keep it up. So, with that, Bianca, thank you so much for this book talk. There were other questions that we were not able to get to, and we will find a way to get these questions to Bianca for response, or if you wish to get a copy of her book. CHSA is selling the book on our website, www.chsa.org, Unassimilable, but Bianca, um, here we go. Unassimilable, an Asian diasporic manifesto for the 21st century. And you probably can't see it, but there it is. So thank you so much for being with us. And I'm going to transfer this or shift this over to Nick, perhaps.
Sure. Thank you so much. Can we just give some love to Bianca and Janice in the chat and reactions? Just thank you so much, Bianca and Janice, for this incredible conversation. We are in a moment right now in history where, Bianca, you're right. It's in a moment where community matters, where finding a political home, engaging politically, it matters. And for our community to really be asking the question of what does it mean for us to get involved? What does it mean for us to shift systems and to be about social impact and justice? And I think in this moment that we are in right now, for the very first in the inaugural Wong Kim Arc Week here, at least in the San Francisco Bay Area, we are starting to create that momentum here to really push back on this executive order to end birthright citizenship. And so, Bianca, I just want to say thank you so much again for joining us, for taking time out to be here. And again, to our community who's viewing online, please check out Bianca's book, Unassimilable. You can learn more on her website here in the chat. And if you had a question for Bianca, we'll be sure to gather all of those questions and send those over to her for further reflection. And if she has time, maybe she'll respond back to them. But again, thank you to the Chinese Historical Society of America. Janice, thank you so much for moderating today's conversation. And for folks who are following along what's going on with Wong Kim Arc Week, we are having a week-long series to honor this landmark legacy and to advocate for birthright citizenship. And so later today, many of us will be gathering in person at the Chinese Cultural Center in San Francisco's Chinatown for a community symposium, followed by Thursday afternoon. The Chinese Culture Center is hosting a in-person walking tour of San Francisco's Chinatown. And lastly, on Friday, we will be hosting a press conference to honor Wong Kim Arc and his legacy because he was born in San Francisco's Chinatown. Um, and then I will just say one last thing is the San Francisco Public Library is having a book display of Asian American authors right now. So check that out if you are out here in the Bay Area. And for more information on how to get involved and how to advocate and protect birthright citizenship, we encourage folks to visit caasf.org/Wong Kim Arc. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll see you very soon.